Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a stack of sources right here, articles, reports, all focused on a critical recent event in the Middle East.
Right. A lot of material to get through.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is really to take this material, pull out the key insights. We want to understand the different perspectives the actions describe.
Especially Iran's response, right? The whole Article 51 invocation.
Exactly. What do these specific sources tell us about what happened and how different countries reacted?
Well, the sources we have here, they lay out a sequence. They talk about Israeli strikes, then how other nations responded, Iran's justification using Article 51, and then, the subsequent Iranian actions. It's quite a picture based just on this information.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning according to these sources. What do they say happened first?
They describe what sound like large-scale Israeli military strikes. The targets mentioned are Iranian nuclear and military sites.
Any specifics mentioned in the material?
Yeah, reports mentioned places like the Natanz enrichment facility being hit, and importantly, the sources state these strikes reportedly caused significant casualties.
Casualties meaning?
Well, they mention senior military officials and scientists killed, and one source cites Iran's UN envoy, reporting 78 deaths, claiming most were civilians, and over 320 injuries. That's the information presented in that report.
Wow. Okay, so then the international reaction, as presented in these sources, that seems pretty key here.
It really is. It wasn't quiet. These materials detail pretty widespread, significant condemnation from multiple countries, too.
And the language used, what do the reports highlight there?
It's strong. For example, sources point to Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry calling the actions heinous attacks, a clear violation of international laws. Qatar, similarly, denounced them, the sources say, as a flagrant violation of Iran's sovereignty and security, really emphasizing that international law aspect.
So mainly Gulf states initially.
Not just the Gulf, the UAE is mentioned in these materials, calling for restraint. Iraq's prime minister, too, the reports quote him calling it military aggression.
And beyond the region.
Even Russia. Described in some sources as a key Iranian partner, they reportedly issued a strong condemnation.
What do they say, according to the reports?
Officials quoted accused Israel of violating the UN Charter, engaging in actions described as whipping up anti-Iranian hysteria. So these sources really paint a picture of broad international disapproval of those initial strikes.
Okay, so given that reaction described and the reported strikes and casualties, how did Iran officially respond based on these sources?
Right. This is where Article 51 of the UN Charter really comes into focus in these materials.
This self-defense article.
Exactly. The sources explain that Iran, terming the initial events an armed attack and citing those reported casualties, formally invoked its inherent right to self-defense under Article 51, which, allows states to respond until the Security Council acts.
And they framed the initial strikes quite strongly.
Yes. One report cites Iran's foreign minister describing them as, quote, a declaration of war.
So, invoking Article 51.
Yeah.
Then what happened next, according to the source?
Then comes the retaliation described in the materials. Following that invocation, Iran reportedly launched over 100 drones and ballistic missiles.
Towards Israel.
Yes. Reports cited in these sources mention explosions in major Israeli cities. Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are specifically named.
And did the sources mention if these hit anything?
They do. They bring in media reports that they say confirmed specific targets were hit, things like the Israeli Defense Ministry, other important sites.
Okay.
And other reports are quoted describing Tel Aviv and Jerusalem as being, quote, hit by the missile, achieving their right targets. That's how the sources frame the reported impact.
So if we zoom out and look at the whole picture presented in these sources, we see this chain, the initial strikes as described.
Leading to that reported international outcry.
Right. Then Iran's specific legal move, citing Article 51, based on the attack and casualties reported.
Followed by the retaliatory strikes they describe, and the reported impact on targets in Israel.
Okay. So wrapping this up, thinking only about the information and viewpoints laid out in this specific set of sources, what's the takeaway for you, the listener?
Well, these sources detail this sequence. Reported Israeli strikes drawing that significant international condemnation from various nations,
right,
which reportedly led Iran to formally use UN Article 51, claiming self-defense based on an armed attack and the reported casualties.
And followed by those described retaliatory strikes hitting reported targets in major Israeli cities and military sites.
We've seen how these materials describe the initial strikes, the diverse global reactions presented: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Russia.
We covered Iran's justification tied to Article 51 and the reported casualty figures, and how the sources describe the impact of Iran's response.
So the final thought, based purely on how these sources present things, considering the events described, the different international views highlighted, and Iran's specific use of Article 51 after reporting casualties, what does this particular interaction depicted solely within this material suggest to you about the real complexities of international law and self-defense in today's conflicts? Something to think about.